Welcome back to By the Numbers. Today we are going through university statistics for private universities. 2 weeks ago we did a similar video for public universities, and you can see those average numbers here if you'd like to check those out and compare them against the numbers we're discussing today. I am also going to be making a video next week about the most important things and most statistically significant differences between public and private universities when it comes to these statistics, so you can also wait for that to see what the results are. Just like last time, there are 4 areas we're going to be talking about. That's going to be cost, admissions, demographics, and outcomes. So we'll go ahead and we've got timestamps in the description below. If there's one of those that interests you more than others, you can go ahead and jump ahead to that. Let's go ahead and start right away with cost. This is one of the things that jumps most readily to people's minds when they think about the difference between a public university and a private university, is that private universities are exorbitantly expensive. Well, the numbers show that they're right. No surprise there, but the average cost for tuition and fees for a single year at a private institution is $53,646. That's almost as much as all your tuition at a regular university for 4 years. That's a huge thing to take on if you don't think you'll be getting any financial aid or scholarships. So definitely something to consider before you attend, depending on your... The other things to think about with cost is room and board. They average out almost $16,000 per year for room and board at a private university. And then that makes the estimated total cost almost $75,000 a year just for tuition and living costs. So that is pretty ridiculous, huge expense. And that's how you hear these stories about students who go and they end up with $100,000 or $200,000 or $300,000 of student debt, oftentimes just from an undergrad, let alone their graduate degree. So cost here is something to be aware of, and the stereotypes are true about the costs. Important section number 2 is admissions, and here I'm actually going to make a distinction between 2 different data sets. So when I gathered this data originally, I went for the top 2 universities in every state. I then realized that there were some that were public and some that were private. So on this list of private universities, I have a lot of the very top typical ones, Harvard and MIT and all these really, really famous big private schools, Ivy League schools. But I also have mixed in some smaller state private schools, like University of Denver. It's a private school in Colorado, and they're maybe not quite ranked so high. So I have quite a few top 100 private schools, and then I also have some lower ranked private schools. So I took this admissions data with those lower ranked schools that were kind of outliers, as well as excluding those in the data set. So the first thing to look at is the admissions rate. When you think about these private or high profile schools, the admissions rate is always something to think about. The average with those outliers was 28%, but if you take out those lesser known private schools, the average admission rate was 18%. And if you look at the really top schools like Princeton or Harvard, it's even lower. It's under 10%, single digit admissions rate, so very, very hard to get into. We can also see from the test scores of why that might be, and that's because the SAT score with the outliers is 1415 and without is 1458. So either way, you have to be in the top maybe 5% or less of high school students with your SAT scores, and a similar result with the ACT scores of a 31.6 with the outliers in the dataset and a 32.8 without the outliers in the dataset. As far as test preferences, it was split about a third, and a third. So 17 schools preferred the SAT, 13 schools preferred the ACT as far as just what the students were submitting more than the other. And about 13 schools were split, which means about 50-50 or within 10% of each other. And oftentimes for schools like these, students would submit both to make their application more competitive. Now with admissions, especially these low admissions rates, a lot of people apply to these schools just to say, I'll fill out an application, I'll give it a try. And so that artificially lowers their admissions rate because they've got a larger pool of people applying, and that larger pool is oftentimes people who aren't ever actually interested in going there. They're just curious to see if they could get in. So those admissions rates are low, they are hard to get into, but maybe not as low as they would seem if people didn't apply there just for the prestige of saying I was accepted to Harvard, even if they then go to their state school. All right, let's go to set number 3 of our statistics, and that is student body demographics. The first thing I want to look at is student body size, and for a private school, it's smaller than a public school, and it's about 15,000 students. So that's, not a small amount of people, but compared to some universities, that is, half or a third of the size. So it's a little bit tighter knit, smaller classes probably, so you got more teachers per student. And that might be part of what raises the rankings or raises the prestige of these universities, is it's less people, a more personal experience, perhaps. The next few I want to run through just really quickly is that these schools are 46% non-Caucasian, so almost 50-50. So minorities are well represented at schools like these. As well, they have 9 to 10% international students. So that makes them a great option if you're coming from out of the US, because you will have other international students and probably better international student programs. On the other hand, international students are usually less eligible for scholarships and programs, so you're going to be on the hook for that full cost. So keep that in mind if you're an international student. The student body here is also pretty balanced, 52% female, so again, nearly 50-50. One really interesting statistic here is that they're about 23% in-state. So these private universities mostly have people from all around the country. And now you could look at certain states like, or certain universities like MIT in Massachusetts. Massachusetts isn't a very big state, so what are the chances it was going to have 90% enrollment from in-state? So it is something to consider. Most of these are located, a lot of them, in New England, where the states are really small. But it is also something to consider that if you want to be surrounded by people who are like you, from the same place as you, a private school, especially a high-profile private school, is probably not for you. The last thing is going to look at household income background. And the average household income for a student accepted into a private university is almost $78,000, and therefore only 17% of students end up getting Pell Grants, which is lower than the public universities. So again, if you're worried about fitting in, there's a chance that students who go to these high-profile schools may come from a wealthier socioeconomic background than you, and you might have a hard time relating. That's not a reason not to go. But it is something, a difference to be aware of, and you can look all over YouTube and see videos of, what is Harvard really like, what is Yale really like, what it's like to be a poor student at a Ivy League school. And you can learn from people's experiences there, because I didn't attend one of them, so I'm sharing the numbers, and if you want anecdotal evidence and experiences, they're out there for you. Definitely check those out. The last group to look at is student outcomes. And by this, again, this is what they do after college and, loans, salary, things like that. So first of all, we see that private universities graduate a lot more students and a lot faster. They have a 76% four-year graduation rate, and they have an 86% overall graduation rate. So those are pretty good. If you are a student who goes to a private university, very, very likely you will actually graduate. And this is sort of if you look at the sources or the causes, yes, it could be that the people who go to private universities are already more academically successful, and therefore they're more primed to graduate. But on the other hand, there are possibly better programs, more support, better professors. I'm not saying professors there are easy, but they might be, because of that more close-knit environment and their connections, they might be more likely to succeed. If you look at the graduate salary, we see it's almost $62,000, which is well above what it was for the public universities, and it's almost the median household income for the US, which I believe is $67,000 if I remember correctly. So that means that you could graduate out of college, and as a single income for your household, you could be making more than almost 50% of people in the US, or 50% of households. Then imagine if you had, a working spouse and you doubled that, you would be climbing up and making more than most people in the US. So that is an advantage of these private universities, is because of their connections and the prestige, the positions you can get and the salaries you can get are much higher because of that name on your diploma. If it's worth the cost, it's up for you to do the analysis. We do see here, though, that the average student loan debt is much lower than you might think. It's only at $20,383. Which, again, this totally shocked me. For an education that on paper should cost you at least $300,000, How are they escaping with so little student loan debt? And that's where programs and endowments and scholarships and alumni donations all help cover the costs, especially if you come from a low-income family. Then schools like these Ivy League schools will tout that you don't have to pay a dollar. They'll do a financial analysis, see how much your family should be able to contribute, kind of like FAFSA, and then they'll cover the rest. So that's why it might be worth it to apply to these, especially if you come from a lower income, is because it might end up being mostly paid for. With that student loan debt and the graduate salary, that means I have about a 37% debt to income ratio on graduation, which is fantastic. I mean, obviously, we all want to avoid student loans, but compared to certain situations you hear about, 37% is not bad. And then the last thing is that 36% of students receive federal aid, so still a decent chunk, but definitely not the majority are receiving federal student aid at a private university. Hopefully this data will be helpful to you in making a decision, and you can see the differences between public and private. I'm going to highlight the differences that I think are most interesting and most important in a video next week, so stay tuned for that. And in the meantime, if you're looking for college tips, college advice, you're trying to foresee some of the issues you might have and address them, check out this playlist over here for College 101, and it should be able to answer all your questions about student loans, class schedules, roommates, and anything else you might be able to think of. Thanks for watching this episode of By the Numbers. We'll see you next time.